How's it going, everybody? Josh here checking in for the latest video for our Black Level membership here on YouTube. And I'm very excited about talking about this subject because this was actually a suggestion that you gave me based on the last video I did about TX Comp versus TX Pro. And it came up during that conversation about how there are ways to make it so TX Pro and TX Comp can sort of find a middle ground in terms of feeling with how you adjust the bindings. So what we want to do first is I want to talk about how bindings work in terms of stiffness and in terms of pivot point. Oftentimes with Telemark bindings, many people think when they say the word stiffness that they're just referring to the tension of the spring, which is actually where stiffness in a binding comes from. But what many people don't realize is pivot point is also something that comes into play and makes a binding feel more neutral or less neutral depending on the position of where your foot is pivoting. So today I made this nifty contraption to sort of illustrate this idea of pivot point, and then I'm going to give you some binding examples so we can kind of see what we're talking about. And like I said before, it's really important that you understand the relationship of the pivot point on a binding and be able to recognize it and understand whether that pivot point has adjustability or does not have adjustability. If there's no adjustability in the pivot point, then we are solely going to be able to rely on the spring tension and what spring options might be available in a binding to make it feel different. So this little contraption I built here, I just took this small piece of wood that we usually mount bindings on, and I took a simple ski strap here and taped it down, and you'll see it's loose like this, okay? And so what I want to illustrate is on a binding, where the pivot point is essentially with a cable binding where the cable catches on the eyelets on the side of the cable binding, or if it's an under the foot cable routing, where that is catching as well. So this taped part that I'm showing here is going to represent the front of where your boot's going to be, okay? And then I've left this back as if it were a Telemark binding coming up, okay? So the important thing to remember is the more neutral feeling a binding has, the pivot point is further towards the toe, okay? And then as the binding pivot point goes back towards the heel, it creates what we would call a more active binding. And that's typically the terminology that you're going to hear with Telemark bindings is active versus neutral. The way I'm going to show this is if this is the toe of the boot up here and the pivot point is located right by the toe, and I'm going to show more of a profile view, this is what like a 3-pin binding would look like. Basically, it's going to be able to go all the way up, okay? Now, like I said, as we go back a little bit, we're going to add activity as we put the pivot point further back on the binding. So you can basically see there's more of this strap that's being held down. And the relationship of that to your boot is essentially the ball of your foot is in this section. So as we push the pivot point back towards the heel of the binding, we're essentially activating the ball of the foot more, making it a more active feel. So you can see as I go back here, more of that straps down, go back here, more of the straps down in the front, and this is what's creating a more active feel. So if you look at it from a profile perspective, you can see what's happening here, okay? So imagine that your boot's in here, you're basically getting this sensation of, can I go all the way up, or is it activating the ball of the foot where more of the ball of my foot is being activated by the binding? So let's look at an actual binding and see what's going on when you do have an adjustable pivot point. So this is the front piece of the 22 Designs Lynx binding, which is a tech toe binding. So you can see the toe fastens into this section of the binding right here, and the second heel connects into this part of the binding back here. So like I mentioned, this has 2 springs on this particular binding, and that determines the stiffness of the binding. So for instance, this actually, there's a way to increase the preload of this by adding what's called a spacer, which is this little thing right here, okay? We'll get into that a little bit more in terms of that, but the simple way to look at it is you can have a stiffer spring and that makes the binding stiffer. Now what's unique about most of the 22 Designs bindings, including the Lynx, the Vice, the axle binding, and even the hammerhead binding, is it has what's called an adjustable pivot point. So you'll see right here these 3 holes, right? Okay, and on the side here, these 3 holes correspond to pivot point. Now, like we discussed, this first hole is essentially the first position. You've got a middle position and a third position, okay? And like I was showing with the strap, as you go towards the toe of the binding, it's going to create a more neutral feel. So this one has a little strap, kind of similar to the strap, you know, where I was putting my finger down. This piece on the Lynx binding does a similar thing. It goes over this part of the binding, and you can switch it to the first position, the middle position, or back here. And then it's held in by what's called a slick pin, okay? So the example I used showing my finger holding that ski strap down, you can now understand that by putting the slick pin into this, it's gonna allow it to pivot at that position. Or if I move it back, it's gonna become more active by putting the slick pin in the third position. Now to really hit this point home and let you see some other examples, I've got a few skis with different bindings on them, and I've put some boots in, okay? You'll notice on the side here, I've made a small black mark with a marker that indicates the pivot position of this particular binding. This is the Black Diamond 02 binding, okay? And so this mark represents where the cable is going to catch when this comes up, okay? So it's a little harder to activate it, right, when you're just doing it with your hand, but you can imagine with your foot in it, leaning forward, you're compressing the bellows of the boot, and it's allowing it to travel, but the cables are gonna be catching at this point. So what I did is this measurement from this area of the toe of the boot back to this line where the cable catches is actually 3.5 centimeters, okay? And I'm gonna show you a couple other examples and give you the measurements of that. This is actually a fairly neutral binding in terms of where it allows it to catch. And I'm gonna show you without the boot in here, if this moves freely, you can see that line corresponds to where this cable is coming up. Okay, so that's kind of a side view of it, and then we're showing how it allows it to come up all the way. Now, this also has springs on it, okay? And there, for instance, this binding had free flex, mid-stiff, and ridiculously stiff cartridges that you could purchase aftermarket, you know, and swap them out, and you could get a stiffer binding. But what you can't change on a binding like this is the pivot point, okay? So that pivot point is simply determined by where that cable allows the travel of the cable to go to, and that's what's creating the pivot point or the activity or neutrality of the binding. Okay, so the second example is one that a lot of people have seen this binding. It's the G3 Targa. Most of the time, I consider this probably the most neutral binding, and it feels pretty neutral. You'll notice that I've got a mark on the boot right here, and it corresponds to this little eyelet where it's gonna allow the cable to travel. Again, going back to that reference of the ski strap mounted to the piece of wood I was showing you, is this is where essentially my finger is gonna go to catch that cable and allow it to create the activity of the binding. Again, there is no pivot adjustability on this particular binding. So where this line is at and is where that cable is going to catch. So there's no way to adjust that pivot point, okay? So we're about 3.5 centimeters on the Black Diamond O2 binding. This is actually 4 centimeters from toe back to this. But I want to point out too is, honestly, having skied both bindings before, I actually think that this traditional cable design probably feels even more neutral. And it may be because of the cable going around the outside and maybe even the angle of how the cable comes out of the eyelet versus the O2 binding, where the cable is what we call underfoot cable routing. So there's all these little factors that could play into it and nuances. But suffice it to say that this Targa and the O2 binding I showed are similar in terms of the measurement from the pivot point from the toe of the boot, and both are fairly neutral bindings. So moving on to the NTN binding that is most used by people these days, at least coming out of our shop, which is the Outlaw X by 22 Designs. Like I said, I showed you the Lynx binding, which was the tech toe binding. It had adjustable pivot. The Outlaw X does not have an adjustable pivot point. So I've made a small mark on the boot that you'll be able to see, and it corresponds to where the pivot point is. So this is 6.5 centimeters back from the toe of the boot. So these measurements are just ones I came up with just to illustrate from the toe back to the pivot point. But you can see this is 2.5 centimeters further back, which again is going to create a more active binding. And this, unlike the Lynx, does not have an adjustable pivot. So it's more similar to those cable binding examples that I was using. Okay, so I've got the bottom part of a TX Pro in here. I'm gonna pop that out, and I wanna show you right here, you can see this little rivet, okay? And that's what I was marking the boot off of. And what you'll notice is keep your eye on this rivet, and this is where that binding comes up to, okay? So that is the pivot point of this binding, and it can't be changed. So all of this pivot point talk is to really get you understanding where the adjustability is at when we start talking about boots and bindings and the relationship between the two. So the Outlaw X comes with a standard spring. There also are offerings for a stiffy spring or a softy spring, okay? So as the names indicate, one stiff, one soft, one standard, okay? So you have these 3 options. And within the spring options, obviously just adding a stiffy spring is going to make the binding stiffer, but it's not gonna change the pivot position, okay? So that's very, very important to understand. So you're gonna get additional stiffness from that. Now, the other thing on the Outlaw binding is back here, we have 5 lines on this little cap. Now, we can increase the preload of this spring by tightening it down and essentially loading the spring, and that also gives more sensation of stiffness, okay? And as we back it off into the first position, for instance, it's gonna feel more neutral in the spring because it has less preload, okay? So this is where we get into the boot discussion. I was talking about TX Pro versus TX Comp, the 2 NTN Scarpa boots, and obviously the women's TX Pro as well. The first thing you can do is, this is the bottom shell of a TX Pro. The TX Comp, you can link to the video and look at the comparison of both. And it talks about the stiffness of the boot. So the TX Comp is 120 flex. This is 110. But what I've found over the years is with a standard spring, for instance, a TX comp on the first setting, so no preload onto the spring, position 1, most neutral on the binding with a stiffer boot, I feel is similar to a less stiff boot at a 110 flex with it cranked up to somewhere between 3 to 5, okay? So what we're doing is we're not really changing the boot per se, because you're not changing the plastic and the dynamics of the plastic, but what you are changing is the sensation of the spring, okay? And what that's doing is creating sort of this middle ground that I'm talking about. If you have a stiffer boot, less preload on the spring, or even a softer spring, you can achieve something similar with a softer boot with a stiffer spring, okay? I don't have a really precise breakdown at this point of maybe where that is on a graph or some sort of a chart, but that's a good place to be to understand, you know, if I have a TX Pro, which is the softer between the TX Pro and the TX Comp, is I can achieve maybe not a stiffer boot, but a stiffer overall sensation by increasing the spring with a stiffer spring or additional preload, okay? Or if I have the stiffer boot, I can back it off and achieve sort of a similar feeling there, okay? Now, that's sort of the little trick. You're not gonna be able to change the flex of the bellow and the stiffness there, but I do think that that is a good way to look at the binding. In particular, we're talking about Outlaw X today, but I think that's a good place to start. Now, as we're talking about links, here you actually have the ability to not only change the spring preload, which on this, like I was saying, there's a little spacer that can be added here, and you can even add 2 spacers. It's not the easiest thing to do, but it does come with the binding and you're able to do that. Instead of having this cap like the Outlaw X that you can tighten down, you actually have the ability to add these spacers and it holds that preload, okay? So on the links, you can actually change the stiffness of the spring or stiffness of the spring, and you can change the pivot point, okay? And that's really important because understanding the customization options of the bindings really gives you a wider variety of what you can get out of the boot, in my opinion. You're not just stuck with, here's the boot, here's the binding. You know, most of the cable bindings that I showed, yes, you could change the springs on most of them, but you didn't necessarily have the option of changing the pivot point and the spring together. And ultimately, I think that would probably be a good option to see in the future with something like this, is pivot point adjustability and options for springs. And I think that's really what's going to bring you the most options in terms of feel, sensation, and ability to really personalize the use of it. This comes incredibly handy too if you're coming from another binding. Maybe you're coming from one of the cable bindings that I showed and you're coming to NTN and you're trying to figure out how to get the sensation correct. So boot and binding choice is enormously important. But on top of that, understanding pivot point and understanding spring tension and how that affects the stiffness. And then understanding that stiffness, how people look at it, is probably broken into these 2 categories, pivot point and actual stiffness of the spring. So I hope this video was helpful. Hopefully it answered some questions about maybe different options you could have if you have a TX Pro or a TX Comp, and how you could either alter or change the springs to get a different sensation, or in the case of the links, how you could change the pivot point and the springs all together. So hope you enjoyed the video and appreciate you checking it out. Until next time, spread Telemark always.